170226. What if the American Revolution never happened? You're standing in Boston. It's March 1770. You hear shouting, you see redcoats. And in our timeline, this moment hardens into a symbol, one of the sparks that helps light a revolution. But in this story, it doesn't. The shots never become a rallying cry. The fire never catches. And you wake up in a world where the United States never exists. Here's the turning point you need to imagine. London blinks. Early. After years of protests, boycotts, and angry pamphlets, Britain's leaders stop treating the colonies like a cash machine. They still want loyalty, they still want order, but they finally admit a hard truth. You can't govern people who feel ignored and expect them to stay calm forever. So Parliament backs away from the most hated taxes. Not because it suddenly becomes generous, but because merchants in London and Liverpool are tired of bleeding money. Trade matters. Stability matters. And your anger is bad for business. Then comes the bigger concession, one that changes everything. Instead of tightening control after unrest, London quietly expands colonial self-government. Your local assemblies keep more power over budgets and internal rules. Royal governors are told, in plain terms, to stop picking fights over every detail. The message is simple. Keep the empire intact by letting the colonies breathe. And the flashpoints that would have united everyone? They get diffused. In Boston, officials avoid the kind of street confrontation that creates martyrs. Troops are pulled back from hot zones. Commanders enforce stricter discipline. The city stays tense, but the most explosive nights end with angry words, not a defining tragedy. Without one unforgettable spark, no Lexington and Concord-style moment that forces every person to pick a side, your political world fractures. You watch the colonial elite split into two camps. The work within the empire faction grows stronger. Wealthy merchants, lawyers, and local leaders who realize they can gain influence without betting everything on a break. They argue, we can win reforms and keep the protection of the crown. The radicals are still there. They still warn that power always reaches for more power. But now, to many neighbors, they sound like they're sprinting ahead of the public mood. They can't turn frustration into a single, united movement. They can't get enough people to risk everything at once. So, instead of a clean leap into independence, you get a slower, messier bargain. More autonomy, less provocation. The empire holds. And this is where historians do something you and I can actually feel. They look for pressure points. Moments when a system could have released steam instead of exploding. In this version of the 1770s, Britain finds the release valve just in time. But if the revolution never happens, you don't just lose a war. You lose an identity. Because next, you and I have to live inside British America. A place that looks familiar at first, until you realize the future you expected was never going to arrive. British America. Familiar streets, different future. You wake up in a place that feels familiar, but the flag is different. You still live in Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, or New York. You still speak English, you still argue about taxes, but you are not a citizen of a new republic. You are a British subject in British America, and your future depends on how the empire chooses to share power. You still vote in local elections, because the colonies already had elected assemblies. In this timeline, London keeps expanding that system instead of crushing it. You and your neighbors push for more control over local budgets, courts, and land policy. Over time, Britain edges toward a clearer deal. The Crown handles empire-wide defense and foreign policy, while your colonial governments handle most daily life. It starts unevenly, colony by colony, but it moves in one direction, more self-rule, not less. If you know how Canada later became a dominion inside the British Empire, picture something like that arriving earlier, because London wants stability and steady revenue, not constant crisis. Your economy grows faster than you might expect. You live inside a single trading space that links the mainland colonies with the Caribbean. British merchants, insurers, and shipbuilders treat your ports as major hubs. You benefit from protected sea lanes, a powerful navy, and access to credit from London. You still hear complaints about rules set far away, but you also see why many people accept the bargain: jobs, trade, and markets that feel predictable. Investors trust an empire that looks permanent, so you see more shipyards, more warehouses, and, over time, more factories. Britain also encourages expansion west, but more cautiously than in our timeline. It wants to avoid expensive frontier wars and stop agreements with native nations from collapsing into chaos. That doesn't mean the frontier becomes peaceful. It means the pressure is managed differently. More negotiation, more slow-grinding conflict, fewer dramatic breaks that turn into national myths. Now, we have to face the hardest issue in this world: slavery. Without an American Revolution, you don't get the same political path that led to the Civil War in our timeline. Two outcomes become more plausible. In one, abolition comes later but more peacefully, because Britain abolished slavery across most of its empire in the 1830s, and pressure builds to apply similar policies in British America. That would still cause fierce political conflict, especially in the plantation regions, but it might be forced through gradual laws, compensation fights, and strict imperial enforcement. In the other outcome, abolition is delayed for decades by powerful local interests. Then, when the pressure finally breaks through, it does so violently: mass protests, crackdowns, and a constitutional crisis that forces Britain to choose between unity and reform. Either way, you live in a society where this one issue shapes everything: elections, migration, business, and what rights mean in daily life. And here's the key lesson: the British Empire never rules every place the same way. It uses different models: tight crown colonies in some places, broad local parliaments in others. In this timeline, British America keeps bargaining its way toward a dominion-style system. You don't get a single founding moment. You get a long negotiation. And that makes the next question personal. If your rights arrive slowly, and always as compromise, how far do you trust the system to protect you when the stakes rise? A world map with a missing country. Look at a world map in the 1800s, and the first shock hits hard. There is no United States on it. You still see the coastline. You still see the big cities. But they sit inside the British Empire. That changes what you grow up believing about power. In our timeline, you're taught that a new republic rises and reshapes the century. In this timeline, the empire stays stronger for longer, and British America is one of the reasons. You feel that difference in everyday life, not just textbooks. Your ports, your farms, and your factories feed a larger imperial system. Britain has more people, more resources, and more money tied directly to North America. That makes the empire harder to challenge, and it changes how other countries plan their futures. France, Spain, and later Germany and Russia don't face an independent American power across the Atlantic. They face a wider British network that stretches from the Caribbean to Canada to the Atlantic sea lanes. When Britain negotiates, it does so with more leverage, because British America isn't a separate player with its own agenda. It's part of the same machine. As the 19th century moves on, Britain stays more active overseas, and you see fewer moments where America acts as a separate broker between empires. That changes the tone of diplomacy. Smaller countries have fewer alternatives. Trade deals, naval access, and finance lean more toward London, because British America deepens Britain's industrial base and shipping power. You might still hear people dream about full independence someday, but the world doesn't treat you like a rising separate giant. It treats you as part of Britain's reach. Then you hit the early 1900s, and the pressures that lead to World War I build across Europe. In our timeline, the United States stays out at first, then later becomes decisive, financing, supplying, and eventually sending troops. In this timeline, you don't have that option. If Britain enters the war, British America is tied to it through imperial policy. Your local leaders can argue, your newspapers can rage, but your ports and factories become part of Britain's war effort from the start. That spreads the burden across the Atlantic immediately. And because there's no separate American neutrality, loans, trade, and shipping patterns look different from day one. By World War II, the gap grows wider. In our timeline, the US becomes the arsenal of democracy, producing at a scale no one else can match and projecting power across oceans. In this timeline, that role doesn't exist in the same form. British America can still produce a lot, but it produces under imperial control, with different priorities, slower coordination, and more political friction. Britain may start the war with more resources than in our world, but it also carries more responsibilities across a larger empire. Meanwhile, Germany and the Soviet Union face a different balance of opponents and timelines. Japan faces a different Pacific reality too, because there's no independent United States with its own navy, bases, and strategy. So, the 20th century becomes a world where the vacuum is real. If Britain can't dominate the post-war order the way the United States did in our timeline, global leadership fragments. You get more regional power centers, more unstable bargains, and alliances that form differently, because the single huge American-led system never appears. And that leaves you with a personal question. If your home is not the world's central power, who writes the rules you live under, and how much say do you really have? No 1787, no American template. You grow up in a world where the most famous written constitution in modern history never appears in 1787, because the United States never forms. You still hear people argue about rights, representation, and limits on government, but there's no single founding document that becomes the reference point. Instead, you live under a patchwork. British law, colonial charters, local statutes, and reforms layered over decades. Your rights can feel real in daily life, but they also feel negotiable because they arrive through politics, not through one dramatic founding moment. And people still push for change, because life keeps demanding it. You still pay taxes, raise families, start businesses, and expect fair treatment. Over time, British America becomes more self-governing, and that creates pressure to put clearer rules in writing. But the style is different. It looks like gradual reform, expanded voting rights over time, stronger local parliaments, clearer limits on executive power, courts slowly defining what government can and cannot do. You get rights as a growing set of protections backed by institutions, not as one single declaration that resets the world. This also changes how other countries learn from you. In our world, the American founding becomes a model reformers point to. A written constitution, a federal system, checks and balances. In this timeline, that symbol is weaker or missing. Movements still rise because the demand for representation doesn't depend on one country. But without the American example, the timing and language shift. Reformers in Europe lean more on British parliamentary tradition, local uprisings, and later constitutional experiments. Written constitutions still appear, but the global template becomes less American and more mixed. Then there's the cultural piece that hits you directly. The American dream never becomes the world's loudest story. People still work hard. Parents still want a better life for their kids. Ambition doesn't vanish. But the myth sounds different when you're not part of a republic born from a break with empire. The dream becomes closer to imperial citizenship, the promise that if you follow the rules, serve your community, and succeed in business, you can earn status inside a larger system. That can feel stable. It can also feel limiting, because the center of gravity isn't your town, your region, or your nation. It's a distant capital and a sprawling empire. And you notice how identity changes with it. In our world, American becomes a civic identity tied to a constitution, elections, and a national story about self-rule. In this timeline, identity is layered. You are a Virginian, a New Yorker, a Carolinian, a Bostonian. You are also British. You may feel proud of local self-government, but you don't have the same single national narrative that unites everyone around one founding moment. So, what does this mean for our world today? It means democracy and rights still expand, but at a different pace, under different symbols. Global capitalism still grows, but with London holding more influence for longer. Popular culture looks different without an independent United States setting so many trends. And when you ask, who are we? You don't answer with a flag born in revolution. You answer with a long argument, still unfinished, about how much self-rule you can claim inside a system that never fully became yours.